Wendell Potter is a former health insurance executive turned whistleblower who now is the president of the Center for Health and Democracy. Mr. Potter, good to see you.
Thank you, Fred.
So Amy Coney Barrett has written she is an opponent of the Affordable Care Act. If she is confirmed before November 10th, that's when the Supreme Court hears a Trump administration-backed lawsuit against Obamacare. How do you see this potentially playing out?
I think that we all should be very, very concerned that we can lose a lot of the protections of the Affordable Care Act very, very quickly. I think people have forgotten what life was like for so many Americans before the Affordable Care Act was passed, and all the protections that had been made available to Americans could go away. And it affects every single one of us. We tend to think that maybe this affects those who weren't able to get coverage in the past, and that's true. Before the Affordable Care Act was passed, the insurance industry, the companies that I worked for routinely would declare people uninsurable because of their existing condition. Young people were kicked off their families' policies at age 18. Seniors couldn't pick up drugs, the prescription drugs, at a price they could afford. All of that has changed because of the Affordable Care Act. The insurance industry, one thing they know how to do is to make money. And they were making a lot of money by doing things that made it more and more difficult for people to get coverage and the care that they needed. And those protections could go away in a minute.
You tweeted about the evil things that, the insurance companies have the potential of doing to deny you care. Well, the president, says now in his, final year before Election Day that he's got a better plan, that, getting rid of the Affordable Care Act simply makes room for his better plan.
I just don't buy that. He's talked about and is issuing some executive orders, and the insurance industry, I can assure you, will just laugh at that. There is absolutely no way that an executive order would be able to get insurance companies to do the right thing. In fact, one of the things that he hasn't mentioned, and that maybe people have forgotten, I mentioned in that Twitter thread that you mentioned, employees of insurance companies were being given bonuses for finding insured people to dump. And these included women with breast cancer who had been diagnosed, were scheduled for a mastectomy or chemotherapy. And insurance company employees were paid bonuses to find people like that, to rescind their policies so the insurance companies wouldn't have to pay for their coverage or for their care. This is exactly where we would go back to, and it would be just a tragedy if we see that happen. We had several near-death experiences for the Affordable Care Act already, and we would certainly come back again.
And if the Supreme Court, were to overturn the Affordable Care Act, also known as, Obamacare, in the midst of a pandemic, what happens to Americans who have recently lost their jobs, and with that, the health insurance that came from some of those companies that they were working for?
Well, many of those people would just be completely out of luck of being able to find coverage that they could afford. The law created the so-called Obamacare exchanges, which is kind of a safety valve, if you will, for people who've lost their jobs. At least it's available and people can get some subsidies for coverage if they lose their employer-sponsored insurance. We've seen during this pandemic that more than 45 million people have lost their jobs, at least temporarily, and at least 12 million have lost their health insurance and haven't been able to find it elsewhere already. We would be in a situation in which far more people would be uninsured and underinsured as well, too. Before the Affordable Care Act, we were getting close to 50 million people who didn't have insurance. We would rapidly be right back there, if not worse, because the population has increased. It would be a huge tragedy. One thing, too, for people in their 50s and 60s, they need to understand that they are particularly vulnerable because insurance companies would jack up the rates of people as they got older, particularly people in their 50s and 60s, to a point they just simply could not afford insurance. And that's why a large percentage of those 50 million people back then were people who were not quite eligible for Medicare, but they were just not able to afford getting insurance on their own.
Wow, not afford the insurance and certainly not be able to afford getting the care they need out of pocket. Wow, that's sobering. Wendell Potter.